Us. In two separate recent events, we have watched as all living presidents, both current and former, came together in a rare moment of unity.
How about that? The first was the funeral for former President Jimmy Carter, and most recently the inauguration of President Donald Trump just yesterday. They all came together to show honor and support despite their party affiliation. Now an author is using his new book to show how Americans can rebuild trust and find common ground despite a difference in beliefs.
Joining us now to continue the conversation is Mike Robbins, the author of We're All in This Together. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, before we dive into the messaging offered in your book, can you first tell us why you decided to write We're All in This Together?
Well, I've spent the last almost 25 years traveling around the country, speaking to lots of groups, particularly inside of companies like Google, Wells Fargo, Microsoft, Walmart, and a lot of my work is focused on teamwork and collaboration. And one of the things that I've learned from working with great teams over the years is that even when people disagree or there's lots of egos or challenges, there's just this sense of we're in it together. And I have a background as a former professional baseball player. I got hurt years ago playing for the Kansas City Royals, and that was true when I was an athlete as well. And so I wrote this book because I wanted to share some of what I've learned through that journey and really focus on how can we, in today's divisive world, remember that we actually are in it together, even though it doesn't seem like it a lot of the time.
And I know a critical message in your book, Mike, is empathy. And I'm curious, how can we use empathy to maybe better understand each other during this time that we're in right now?
Well, empathy is really about, being interested in understanding other people's experiences. And one of the ways that we can actually elicit empathy in others is to show up with vulnerability. It's the natural human response to vulnerability is empathy. So bringing empathy to other people is one thing we can do by listening and being curious, but also being willing to be a little more real, a little more vulnerable, can potentially elicit an empathetic response in others. So with respect to a lot of the things going on right now in the country, instead of arguing talking points or, debating back and forth on Facebook, what if we actually let people know how we genuinely felt personally? That's usually a better way to start the conversation as opposed to either not talking or simply coming out, pointing our fingers and blaming the other person and telling them they're wrong.
Mm-hmm. And how can strengthening those personal connections be used as the foundation for unity?
Well, look, whether it's a personal connection like someone in our family or someone that we work with, but even one example I often use with connection for other humans, it's like, when you're stuck in traffic, if you're on the freeway and you don't want to let someone merge, what do? You don't look into the other car of the person trying to merge, right? Because as soon as you look over there, once you make eye contact with the person, unless they're screaming at you or flipping you off, you're going to let them in, right? It's a moment of human connection where you realize, oh, sometimes I'm the person trying to merge, sometimes I'm the person on the freeway. And so as an example, right, if we can remember humans are humans, can we find common ground with some of the people maybe we disagree with? Can we be a little more curious? Why do you think that way? Why do you feel that way? And when we communicate with each other, can we actually use I statements? This is what I think, this is how I feel, this is what I've learned, this is what's important to me, not to be selfish, but instead of once we use the word you, we put the other person or the other people on the defensive.
I love that example that you gave, Mike, because we can all picture ourselves in that situation, being out on the freeway and being
absolutely.
like, you're not getting in, or go ahead.
Okay,
Yes.
come on over.
Yes, go ahead. So how can we use the us versus them mentality maybe as an opportunity for collaboration?
Look, one of the things that I've learned as I travel around the country talking to different groups in different environments and different, communities where maybe it's more conservative or it's more liberal. Most people right now, even with everything going on in our country and our world, I find are concerned about the polarization and the division. Now, maybe we have different reasons for why we think that's the case. But at some level, if we can unify around one thing right now, it's that most of us don't want to live in a country where we're screaming and yelling at each other all the time. And it's my team or my side and your side. Like, that's not what this is about. Having debates, having discussions, disagreeing is totally healthy and American. But remembering at some level, again, without being corny about it, we really are all in this thing together. So we're going to rise and fall collectively. And then you brought up the examples as you were introducing me about Jimmy Carter's funeral, or even about the inauguration yesterday, separate from any of the rhetoric or the conversation. There's something I think that most Americans really appreciate seeing when we see all of our former leaders together even knowing they maybe have said certain things about each other or disagree with one another. But at some level, there are things that are bigger than partisanship or, specific policy debates. There's what brings us together as Americans and ultimately as humans.
Absolutely. You went through so many of the messages emphasized in your book. But overall, what is your hope for people after reading this? What do you hope they take away from it?
I think it's really about, again, being willing to show up authentically and being curious to connect with other people, especially when people may look at things differently. The natural human response to self-righteousness, which is I'm right, you're wrong, is defensiveness. And I think we've gotten into a place in this country for a bunch of reasons where we walk around self-righteous and angry a lot of the time, when in reality, we don't have to water down our opinions or take away our passions. But if we could remove the self-righteousness that says just because I think it, just because I believe it, it's true, we might actually be able to connect with people who are different than we are, learn some things, and realize we actually have a lot more common ground than I think we often realize.
How about that? We're all in this together. Mike, thank you so much for joining us, and congrats on the book and a very timely conversation to bring us this morning. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.